Okay, welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. I'm your host, Pedro Laveria, and today we're going to go over the Syntergic Theory of Dr. Jacobo Grinberg. Now, I got turned on to this by watching the Psicoactivo podcast by Pavel Ibarra, and what's really interesting about the Syntergic Theory, in my view, I mean, there's many interesting things, right? But I think that the Syntergic theory might explain some of the more puzzling aspects of the UFO phenomena. And what's great about this is that it might explain those troubling aspects in a way that's scientific, right? So it's a scientific theory that can be tested and falsified, right? So even if we can't get to the bottom of the UFO phenomenon with regards to where are they from, why are they here, if we have a scientific theory that can explain what witnesses are seeing, then it doesn't almost doesn't matter, right? Because then we can do that stuff on our own. We can advance our own science on our own without having to worry about who the others are, right? If we can figure out how they're doing what they're doing, then maybe we can do it ourselves. And in the process, maybe get closer to finding out who or what they are. But even if we don't, we get to further our own science in the process, right? And the great thing about the Syntergic theory is that it is a scientific theory. It can be falsified, right? You can test it, make predictions, test it, see if those predictions come true, and if they don't, you can it or improve it. Now, a little bit about the Syntergic theory. So, this episode should probably be titled "Understanding the Syntergic Theory," right? Because when you approach it the first time, it might be a little difficult to understand. So, I think the first thing to understand about the Syntergic theory is that it's not finished, right? It's an unfinished work, right? Jacobo Greenberg, Dr. Greenberg disappeared in 1994 at the young age of 47, right? At 47 years old, right? Arguably, maybe in his kind of intellectual peak, perhaps. So this theory is not complete, right? We can rightfully assume if he had been allowed to continue his work, it may look a little different from what it is now, right? Or maybe it might be more detailed, or he may have been able to explain it better, um, test it more, and refine it, right? So that's the first thing to understand, that it's an incomplete work, right? Because the good doctor disappeared in 1947. Another thing to help understand it is to understand that Jacobo Greenberg was not a physicist and he was not a philosopher in the classically trained sense of the word, right? He was a neurophysiologist and a psychologist. And the reason why that's important to understand is that if he were a physicist, right, like Al Puthoff, then maybe he could have spelled out the Syntergic theory in purely mathematical terms, right? Um, but that's not what he did, right? And if he was a philosopher too, maybe he could spell out the Syntergic theory with a more detailed precision, right? A greater precision, you know, by being very nitpicky with regards to the definitions of certain words and that sort of thing, as we'll see later. But that's very important to understand, right? He's not a classically trained philosopher, so his description of the Syntergic theory may not be as crisp and precise as we might like in terms of prose. And he wasn't a physicist, right? So his description may not be as mathematically rigorous as we would like, right? He was a neurophysiologist and a psychologist. And the other thing to understand is that he was an experimentalist and a field researcher, right? So, with regards to psychology and neurophysiology, um, he was in the field doing the thing, right? So, the Syntergic theory is not something he concocted by wondering how Einstein, fits with quantum mechanics, right? And trying to just, sitting at Starbucks writing out a bunch of mathematical formulas or something, right? He was doing parapsychology uh, with shamans, right? So he would go to where the shamans were in Mexico, and he would take their mushrooms that they prescribed, the hallucinogenic mushrooms. He would work with them and assist them in their shamanic surgeries that they were doing, right? And he was seeing things that didn't make any sense and that he needed to explain, right? So because he couldn't explain them with the science he had learned in college. He needed to create a theory that would explain why these things were happening, how they were happening, and when they were happening. So that's what the Syntergic theory is. It's a reaction to what he saw in the field, studying these shaman and seeing what they were doing, which was just weird and miraculous, right? And he was an experimentalist, right? He was a parapsychologist, right? So he was doing experiments with ESP and that sort of thing, using very strict scientific protocols. And again, he was getting results that he needed to explain scientifically. He needed a scientific theory that explained why this was happening, right? So those are three big important parts to understand with regards to the Syntergic theory, right? And they really explain some of the like limitations it may have with regards to mathematical rigor or just philosophical rigor, right? Um, so let's continue. This is the UNAM, the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, the Mexican Autonomous National University. If you don't know, this is the largest university in Latin America. Again, not the largest university in Mexico, the largest university in Latin America. It's bigger than anything Brazil or Argentina or Chile has. It has a quarter of a million students, and the acceptance rate is less than 10%. Okay. They've produced presidents of Mexico, presidents of Costa Rica. This is a very serious school, and it's not easy to get into. And again, it's the largest school in Latin America and seems to have a beautiful campus. So the first thing to understand about the Syntergic theory is that you can rightfully describe Greenberg as a Kantian in the sense that um, he accepts that there is a difference between the world as it actually is and the world as we experience it through the five senses. Um, I recommend some of these papers right here. If you really believe that what you experience from your five senses is literally true, and that it's not some symbolic representation which corresponds to objective reality, and you confuse it for objective reality yourself, you are behind the curve. Um, Kant's initial insight, I mean, it's beyond demonstrably true. So that's the first thing. The second thing to understand is, again, how uh, Jacobo Greenberg is using some of these vocabulary, these words in describing his theory. So I will quote. He said, I have now, in 1988, mind you, this book was written in 1988. I have now come to the conclusion that everything that exists is a particular level of consciousness, including what we call matter. So again, Jacobo Greenberg is an idealist in terms of his metaphysics, right? But he goes on to say, I have used terms like quantum field, lattice, and high syntergic space to convey the same meaning. Okay, so that's another thing to understand with regards to syntergic theory. Uh, when Jacobo Greenberg uses a term like quantum field, that is for him a synonym for lattice, which I will describe later. And it is also a synonym for a high syntergic space, right? So high syntergic space, lattice, and quantum field are synonyms for Jacobo Greenberg, and he uses these terms interchangeably, right? So when you read his book, keep that in mind, okay? He also uses terms like self, pure I, and central processor as synonyms, okay? So again, that's kind of like the philosophical imprecision, right? That's not a knock. It's just something you have to understand when you read him. So this is a lattice. Okay. This is also a lattice. Okay. And this is also a lattice. Okay. So the first thing to understand about the Syntergic theory for Jacobo Grinberg is that um, space and matter. So we talk about a space-time continuum, right? That we know from Einstein that space and time are just two aspects of the same thing, right? For Jacobo Greenberg, first thing to understand is that space and matter are two things on the same spectrum, right? So what for Jacobo Greenberg, what exists is a lattice. Okay, so physical reality, objective reality outside of the five senses is a lattice, right? So space-time is this um and well the objective reality outside of us is this lattice of points, right? And each one of these points has all the information in the universe, right? So all the information found in the universe and every other point is found in each point of this lattice. Okay, that's the first thing to understand, right? Again, that's why again I talk about Kant's noumenon and phenomenon, right? For Jacobo Greenberg, the noumenon is the lattice, right? It's this structure with points in every single instance of existence, essentially. And each one of those points has information and it has all the information that exists in every other point. Okay. So that's the objective reality. That's noumenon for Jacobo Greenberg. And so just as energy and matter exist on a spectrum, right? We know from Einstein E equals mc squared that what we call matter is hyper condensed energy. For Jacobo Greenberg, what we call energy can be described as hyper condensed space. Okay. So how does this work? Well, what remember, the objective reality independent of perception is the lattice, right? Okay, but how that lattice is represented on through our five senses in our mind, okay, at space, energy, and matter, is different depending on the point, the part of the lattice we're inhabiting. Okay, so let me explain how this works. Okay, so I told you each point in the lattice, okay, contains all the information found in every other point. However, when that information is cohesive, it's coherent, um, and it's unified, so to speak, um, our minds represent that kind of like in our cognitive user interface, right? A la Hoffman. Our minds represent that as space. Okay. And when that those points on the lattice, right? When the information is less coherent, less cohesive, more entropic, right? That represents itself on this on in our cognitive user interface kind of as energy. And when it's even more incohesive, incoherent, um, more entropic, right? It's represented as matter. Okay. And so in this, so basically in space, what we call space, right, which is devoid of energy. It's not devoid of energy, right? We know there are quantum fields, right? There or a lattice, okay? When we perceive just empty space, right? Let's say you were in a spaceship and the space from that spaceship to the moon is empty, quote unquote. Okay. What that is that part of the lattice, the information in each one of those points in the lattice is again highly cohesive, coherent, uh, and unified, right? Symmetric. Um, Basically the opposite of entropy, right? This would be called synergy. So synergy in Jacobo Greenberg's thought is a it's a new word he invented. It combines um, what is it? Energy and synergy. So synergy and energy, synergy, right? And one way to think about it is maybe as the opposite of entropy. Okay, so that's the difference between matter and energy, okay, for Jacobo Greenberg, but it's also the difference between matter and space. So whereas Einstein might talk about a space-time continuum, Jacobo Greenberg is talking about a space-matter continuum. Okay, that's Very important to understand with regards to Greenberg. And again, you can pause and read this if you want. So that's the difference between, let's say, empty space, quote unquote, because we know it's not empty, they're quantum fields, right? That's the difference between empty space and matter for Jacobo Greenberg, is that simply the the information in each point of the lattice in that empty space is coherent and cohesive, whereas in matter it isn't. And so it's represented as matter in our subjective mind, okay, in our species specific user interface, if you will. Now, this is another important part to understand. Okay, so there is such a thing in Greenberg's thought as neurosynergy. So our brain itself has a level of synergy, okay, in it. Okay, it itself is part of the lattice, right? And the brain itself, as part of the lattice, um, has information in it, and that information is either more cohesive and coherent, or less cohesive and coherent, right? And so essentially, when the information in the lattice is more cohesive and coherent than the information in our brain, okay, again, our brain represents that part of the lattice as space. But when the information in our brain is more cohesive and coherent, right? When the lattice, that part of our brain, which we call brains, right? Which is represented in our species specific user interface in our minds as brain, okay? When that part of the lattice is more cohesive and coherent, the information is more cohesive and coherent, right? When it has less entropy, let's say, than the parts of the lattice outside of the brain, then those parts of the lattice are represented in our minds as matter. Okay. So that's the difference between matter and space for Jacobo Greenberg, right? And why one part of the lattice is represented as empty space and one part of the lattice is represented as matter. And it's simply that that which our minds represent as matter, um, the information in that part of the lattice is less cohesive and coherent than the information which our mind that part of the lattice which our minds represent as empty space. Okay, so now neuronal fields. That's another important part of this theory. Their neuronal field. Okay, so basically this is what happens. So remember, our for Jacopo Greenberg, in terms of physical reality, right? In terms of reality outside of us, objective reality, independent of subjective experience, what you have is the lattice, right? And like I said before, it bears repeating, each part of the lattice, each point of the lattice has all the information contained in every other point. Okay. And like I said, whereas Einstein talked about a space-time continuum, Greenberg talks about a space-matter continuum. Okay. And again, when that information in the lattice is more coherent and cohesive than the information in our brains, right? When there's more synergy in the lattice than in our brain, our minds represent that part of the lattice as empty space. And when there's a higher degree of neurosynergy, right? When our brains, which are part of the lattice, right? When that part of the lattice has the information in each point is more coherent and cohesive than the information outside of it, um, then the information in the parts of the lattice outside of it, then that which is outside of it is represented by the mind as matter. Okay. So neuronal field. So what happens is this, and this is kind of where Jacobo Greenberg shines. Um, Basically, our brains, they're composed of tissue, and those tissues are composed of cells. I'm sorry, and those cells, right, neurons, and a bunch of other cells in the brain that I really don't know anything about, are composed of what? Molecules, and those molecules are composed of atoms, and those atoms are composed of subatomic um, particles, right? And those subatomic particles themselves are excitations with of quantum fields, right? And so basically, Jacobo Greenberg uh, theorized that our our brains are affected by these quantum fields, right? Because again, the subatomic particles are excitations in the quantum fields, and those subatomic particles compose atoms, which compose molecules, which compose cells, which compose tissues, which compose a brain, right? So basically, the brain can affect the quantum fields at a very, very small way, right? That's what he's saying, that these our neurons and other kind of cells in our brain can uh, affect the lattice, okay, ever so subtly, right? And the sum total of those effects, right, is what you would call the neuronal field. And that this neuronal field, according to Greenberg, extends outside of the brain, extends outside of the skull. Okay. How far out, he doesn't know. Okay. But basically, there is a what he calls the neuronal field is basically a field of excitations within the lattice, and these excitations are caused by the workings of the neurons, right? And other kind of cells in the brain that I really don't understand. Okay. So that's what a neuronal field is. And it's important to understand, if you read Greenberg, that the neuronal field is not a field of electricity. He's not talking about electrical fields. Okay. He's talking about a field within the lattice, right? Within, quantum fields, right? And that, so just as the quantum fields, right, affect brain, they constitute the brain, right? There is a feedback, right? There's a kind of like this feedback loop, right? Where the brain itself, um, through mentation, right, affects the quantum fields, according to Jacobo Greenberg, it affects the lattice, right? And that sum total of those effects is what you would call the neuronal field, right? And the thing to understand about neuronal fields is that they can interpenetrate. And interpenetrate and overlap, right? Uh, and what's interesting is that that's how telepathy might work. So Jacobo Greenberg did a really interesting experiment using Faraday cages, right? Because this is part of how he's testing the Syntergic theory, right? Because remember, the neuronal field is not an electrical field, right? It's a field within the lattice, right? It's a field within the very, fabric of space time, right? So, and it's being generated by the brain. So for Jacobo Greenberg, the mind isn't stuck in the brain; it extends past the brain, right? The neuronal field is part of what we properly call the mind, right? And so he did this experiment where, he'd get like these couples and he'd have them meditate together with the intention of being one. And then he'd put one in one Faraday cage and one in the other. And they couldn't see what the other one was doing or what the other one was looking at, right? So he'd have like one of the two people and just look at random flashes of light, right? And then they would like measure the brain activity when he was looking at the random flashes of light versus when he wasn't. And then the other person, they wouldn't see any random flashes of light at all. They would just kind of like be staring at a wall, I imagine. And basically, they would look at their brain states, and they found a correlation, right? Just as the random flashes of light, right, are gonna, viewing that is going to set off some things in your visual cortex, right? Um, because you're looking at something and your brain is processing that thing, right? And that corresponds to your experience of seeing the light, right? So with these couples who had meditated with the intention of being one and unified, uh, person who wasn't seeing the flashes of light, their brain was reacting as if they did. Okay. And you should read this study on your own, but it was replicated in other labs, which is very interesting, right? There were other labs who did replicate study, and I think you should read those papers as well, right? So we have at least one, two, three other labs which replicated the study. I think you should read all those papers on your own and decide for yourself. But it's interesting because if neuronal fields exist, if the synergic theory is true, then psi would not be inhibited by Faraday cages, right? Faraday cages are designed to keep electrical signals from going in and going out. So if the telepathy is happening without electrical signals, then where's it happening, right? Um, for Greenberg, it would be the neuronal field in these kind of interpenetrating, overlapping neuronal fields of the two people. So, that's interesting. That's a prediction of the Syntergic theory, which maybe has been verified. Okay, but of course, more work needs to be done. What I think is interesting, again, let's go back to skinwalkers at the Pentagon. Okay, remember who wrote this book? This book was written by Jim Lukatsky and Colin Kelleher. Okay, who were they? The one was the director of OSAP, and the other one was the operations manager of OSAP. What was OSAP? It was the Defense Intelligence Agency's UFO program. Okay, the one we know the most about, the one that is admitted to have existed. Okay, so it's a Pentagon UFO program. They wrote this book called Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. It had to go through the Department of Pre-Publication Security Review. So basically, just to make sure it wasn't revealing any secrets that the government wanted hidden. All right. So they couldn't say everything they knew, but they could say a lot. Right. And what happened at Skinwalker Ranch? Well, Skinwalker Ranch is a UFO hotspot. So if you have a UFO program, naturally would go where the UFOs are. And one such hotspot is Skinwalker Ranch. And what happened at Skinwalker Ranch? Well, aside from seeing UFOs, people saw impossible animals. Okay. Bipedal wolves don't exist. There is no such thing as a bipedal wolf. And yet, the OSAP personnel who are on the ranch would occasionally see bipedal wolves. And what was really weird about that is that their family members back home, not in Utah, right? Back east, okay, who did not know what daddy was doing at work, right? Because it was a classified UFO program, would see bipedal wolves in the backyard. Again, a anatomically impossible animal, okay? They the spouse would see this and the children would see this. And not only that, but the children's friends would see this. And nobody knew why, because nobody knew what daddy was doing at work, right? So if you read Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, what happens, what you'll find is that again, people were seeing impossible animals on the ranch, okay, having seeing other impossible things, weird things like, glowing balls of light, the so-called orbs flying around, that sort of thing. And they would go back home, back east, okay, when they weren't working on the ranch, right back, Pentagon, presumably. And what would happen, right? Uh, the coworker who shares a cubicle next to them, right? And the coworker doesn't know what they're working on, and they don't know what the coworker's working on. But guess what? The coworker is also having weird experiences at their house, right? The same kind that happened at the ranch, and not just the coworker, but let's say the coworker's cousin, right? Would also have weird experiences. And so what they found at Skinwalker Ranch is that these anonymous at Skinwalkers in the Pentagon, right? At OSAP, right? In the OSAP program, what they found is that uh, these hallucinations, these paranormal experiences, they had the RO of a virus, right? They weren't, it was not a virus, okay? Nowhere do they say it was a virus. Nowhere in Skinwalkers in the Pentagon do they say there was an alien virus, okay? Sorry, debunkers, you don't know how to read. Nowhere do they say it was a virus. What they say is that these things were spreading in the same pattern of a virus. Okay. And so going back to Jacobo Greenberg, if neuronal fields are real, okay, then that may be the substrate through which certain kinds of weird hallucinations could be passed on in the same pattern that a virus would spread. Okay. So that's one thing I think the Syntergic theory would be really good for. Could it possibly explain how these kinds of anomalous experiences, these glitches in perception, okay, these hallucinations, for lack of a better word, could spread in a way similar to how a virus spreads, because the neuronal field might be the substrate through which these very special kinds of subjective experiences might spread from one mind to another. Okay. So that's one thing that I find very interesting. Okay. Another thing, if we go back to my favorite paper ever by Hal Puthoff, describing how UFOs might fly. It goes back to the Alcubierre drive again. Alcubierre, Miguel Alcubierre. The last name is Basque. And Miguel Alcubierre is also a scientist, a physicist who works at UNAM. Okay, so you have Jacobo Grinberg at UNAM and you have Miguel Alcubierre at UNAM. Right? I understand Alcubierre might be justifiable, right? Because there are Basques on both sides of the Spanish and French border. My own ancestors are Basque. Okay, so Alcubierre, it's fair. You can say Alcubierre. Okay, but I bet you he says Alcubierre because he's a Mexican. But anyways, so you go back to Kurov's paper, and basically what he does is like say, look, if an Alcubierre drive was real, what would be the actual physical effects. And what you see is that the physical effects of an Alcubierre drive, assuming it was real, are the same physical effects reported by people who've been abducted by UFOs. So the way they describe the craft, not just abductees, but people basically contact close encounter people, contactees, right? Whether they went in the craft or they touched the craft from the outside or they simply saw it land, whatever, if you take all those things together, they seem to be describing an Alcubierre drive. Okay. Now, Jacobo Greenberg. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Okay. An Alcubierre drive. Okay. It's anti gravity. So the way you might think of it is think of it like an anti-black hole, right? So if you ever saw the movie Interstellar, right, you should know that, the closer you get to a black hole, which is a super, dense mass, right? Uh, this sucks everything up, right? The closer you get to it, slower time goes, spaces contract, um, that sort of thing, right? And that's just true for any kind of mass that has gravitational pull, right? So they've proven Einstein correct, right? They've shown that atomic clocks in zero gravity run faster than atomic clocks on Earth, right? Because gravity slows down time, right? So read this on paper on your own. But basically, Jacobo Greenberg uh, talks about how space, right? Outer space is has higher synergy, right, than space on Earth, right? Because space on Earth, what? We're standing on solid matter, right? And we're surrounded by air, right, which is gaseous matter, right? So the lattice, as far as where we live here on Earth, the lattice, that part of the lattice that we occupy, has less synergy. The information in each point of the lattice is less coherent and cohesive with the information on other points of the lattice, right? But in outer space, that would not be true, right? So, because outer space is highly syntergic, right? There's a high concentration and coherence of information at each point, right? And so, the less gravity there is in Greenberg's theory, the less gravity there is, the more synergy there is. Okay. What's interesting though is if you go back to Puthoff's paper, right? within within the UFO, right? If the UFO is turned on, right, and you go inside of it, it's going to be bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. Okay. Now, I don't know why my screen did that, but it's going to be bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. In other words, space expands, right, within craft powered by an Alcubierre drive, right? Just as space contracts the closer you get to the event horizon of a black hole, right? Inside a craft powered by an Alcubierre drive, space would expand. He only uses the word Alcubierre drive near the end. Throughout the paper, he's talking about engineered space-time metric, right? Alcubierre drive is one version of it. There's other versions of it, but basically an engineered space-time metric. Um, when you're in that craft, it's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, and that's what a lot of abductees describe. Okay, so this is if you take Greenberg's theory, the inside of these craft would have higher synergy than outer space itself. Now, this is what I find interesting. Okay. So this is a little study I'm doing on my own. I do it once a year. Okay. So basically what I did, I got 40 cases. Okay. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them, as you can see, happened before 1994. Why is that important? Because 1994 is when Miguel Alcubierre wrote his big paper on the Alcubierre drive, showing that warp drive is physically possible. Okay, we can't do it. We don't have the technology, we don't have the material science. But in 1994, Miguel Alcubierre, Dr. Miguel Alcubierre, showed that warp drive is physically possible. The laws of physics allow for it. Doing it is another question, much more difficult question, right? So that's why I picked cases before 1994 because the UFO abductee, the witness, doesn't know about the Alcubierre drive. Okay. Now there's one exception here is you see the Bledsoe case from 2007. Okay. And I got these cases and what I did is I grouped them based on their proximity to the craft, to the interior of the craft, right? So what I did was, so I had one bucket for people that went inside the craft, one bucket for people where the craft landed, right? The craft landed, but nobody went inside. Okay, they may have touched it, they may not have. The craft may have burnt the grass, but basically they were close enough to throw a rock at it or touch it, but they did or they didn't, right? So basically, those are the landings, right? So people went inside, people didn't go outside, didn't go inside, but could have, presumably because they had landed. Then I have a bucket for I call surface to air. So the people are on the ground and they see it in the sky. And then I have another bucket called air to air, where the people are in a plane and they see the craft in the air, right? So both the witness and the craft are in the air. Okay. They could be miles apart from each other or not. It just really depends. So I had these four different buckets, right? And what I did is I used Pudov's paper, right? The seven things I'm not seven, I'm sorry. Uh, the things he predicts, right, on the paper, right? These things that he predicts, how they would change within an engineered space-time metric. I used those as kind of like the things I was kind of looking for in these cases, right? So they serve the basis to check them off, essentially, for things to check off. Okay. And then I added an extra category called psychotronics or other psi effects. Okay, psychotronics is the Soviet term for parapsychology. In ufology now they're using the term psionics, but I'm a rebel. So I use the term psychotronics. But that's an extra thing I added, right? Was there some kind of telepathy involved, some kind of clairvoyance, some kind of magic, for lack of a better word, in the case? Okay. And if I saw evidence for that, I put an X. If I didn't, I simply put a question mark. Okay. And then I group them at the end, right? So the spatial, if you see here, like, Pudov separates space from time, right? Energy and frequency, that sort of things. But then I grouped them together at the end for convenience, right? And I saw a pattern, right? And the pattern, there's several patterns I've seen. Okay. One of the patterns is the closer you get to the interior of the craft, the more psychic stuff happens, right? Um, and the closer you get to the interior of the craft, the more stuff, weird stuff happens with space and time, right? The closer you get to the interior of the craft, the more stuff happens with mass, right? Effective mass. So basically gravity issues, right? The big differences though, when you look at energy states and energy states mean rays just kind of means stuff got burned. Okay. So stuff got burned, more likely when you were close enough to touch the craft, right? When either, craft burned grass or, harmed the person that touched it, you know. That was the only time these patterns didn't hold, right? Because the safest place to be with regards to a UFO is either inside of it or very far away from it. If the UFO is turned on, it's landed, let's say, you don't want to touch it. You don't want to get close enough to touch it. Okay, it'll hurt you. You'll get sick. It's radioactive. Okay. But I noticed that again, you can read this on your own, but the psychotronic effects were most pronounced inside the craft, right? And they became the weird psychic stuff happened less the further you got from the craft. Okay. Now, I invite anyone to do their own study using the exact same cases and using the exact same paper and like debunk it or make it better. No ego. I don't care. Okay. This is something I go over about once a year. Okay. And it's not perfect and it's far from finished. But the Syntergic theory might explain that, right? Because again, uh, if, you know, here we go again with my computer. If this stuff is, again, if the space within an engineered space-time metric has higher synergy than the space outside of it, then we would expect psychic phenomenon to be multiplied, right? We would expect more psychic phenomena, right? Um, because whatever is inside that engineered space-time metric, including the neuronal fields of the people inside of it, okay, it's going to have more synergy, right? And so you would presume that, you know, psychic functioning would increase. So if that's true, that's interesting, right? Because if I'm going to make a prediction, if the Syntergic theory is correct, then uh, any kind of psychic functioning is going to be better on the moon than it is on Earth, but it'll also be better in zero gravity in empty space than it is on the moon, right? So essentially, psychic functioning, whether it be remote viewing or telepathy, whatever it is, whatever kind of psi test someone's going to do, they're going to be better at it on the moon than they are on Earth, and they're going to be better at it in empty space than they are on the moon, right? And so that would be, if the Syntergic theory is true, what I predicted should also be true. Again, we're far from being able to predict any of that, to test any of that, right? That would be a prediction. But then even further, again, like I said, if, Puthoff is right and, UFO contactees are right, um, then that means that the intense psychic functioning of the non-humans and the humans inside the craft, right? The closer they get to the interior craft, is a function of the engineered space-time metric and not necessarily a function of their physiology or any kind of technique they have, right? So it may not be an issue of technique, right? In terms of some special meditation technique that they've developed or training they may have, and it may not be a function of physiology. It may be a function of the warp drive itself. That when you are inside an engineered space-time metric, okay, the lattice in that area has a higher degree of synergy than even empty space, and which would mean like an exponential, perhaps, you know, higher degree of psychic functioning. Okay. And last but not least, flying saints, right? So if again, let's talk about the neuronal field, right? Jacobo Grinberg, you know, uh, talks about, highly syntergic spaces as having less gravity, right? Well, if that's the case, and again, remember, we're talking about the brain here, right? Um, let's suppose the brains of these flying saints, for whatever reason, let's say because of their, as Jeffrey Kripal says, when you stop eating and you stop having sex, weird things happen, right? So let's say because of their fasting and their sexual abstinence and their, hours of contemplative prayer, that and their intense love in their hearts for God and for humanity, for whatever reason, all of that causes the neurosynergy to increase exponentially, which causes the neuronal field to change, and so gravity decreases and effective mass decreases. And maybe that's why some of these people are able to levitate in front of hundreds of people, right? Uh, read the book They Flew. I mean, sometimes people fly, right? So there might be an explanation, a scientific explanation vis-a-vis the Syntergic theory, right? If the brains of these people in their intense, contemplative state of the neurosynergy of their brain is much higher than the synergy in the space they're occupying, right? Then perhaps the lattice, the neuronal field they generate um, would also have some kind of effect in terms of their effective mass, causing them to levitate. I don't know. It's just a theory. Tell me what you think. I like the synergic theory, and I really like the fact that it's falsifiable. I mean, it's a scientific theory. And if you watch my channel, I've done a lot of stuff in metaphysics, but this isn't metaphysics. It has metaphysical implications, but it's not metaphysics. This is a scientific theory that can be falsified. And I hope someone takes the baton, right? And fleshes this out with mathematical precision, right? And that would be really cool so that they can make predictions which can be falsified. And I've already made one on this show. I think, like I said, any kind of psychic functioning is going, if the Syntergic theory is correct, psychic functioning will be more, more effect, will be more effective, will be more powerful, stronger on Mars than it is on Earth, more strong on the moon than it is on Mars, and stronger in empty space than it is on the moon, right? If the Syntergic theory is true. And so that's something that in principle can be tested, just maybe not tomorrow. So I hope you like this episode. Read Jacobo Greenberg for yourself. Read his books. I think they're fascinating. I think they're underrated and I think they're important. And I want you to go with what I always say. Your consciousness is not classified. Learn to meditate, learn to pray, and remember that understanding your own mind will teach you more about the UFO phenomenon than watching a bunch of podcasts will. Okay, good night.